Yeah. Hi, everyone. We're at the top of the hour. Looks like people are arriving. We'll give it a minute here. My name's Brian Gross. I'm with the EPA office here in Region 4. We are sharing this presentation with some of our staff from the Environmental Justice Program, the EJ program. So we have kind of a mix of people that were invited. If you're willing to identify yourself, you can just type that in the chat box off to the side in the conversation. Let us know who you are and who you're with. And we're going to go through the Brownfields information first, and then Daphne and Brian Holtzclaw are going to cover some of the environmental justice, and then we can save questions for that time as well.
All right, let's get started.
Yeah, this is being recorded, so just be aware of that. And I'm going to turn it over to Cindy Nolan to get started. Cindy, can everyone see the first slide here? It's just kind of the welcome slide.
I don't see it. I don't think you're showing it.
Okay, let me go back to it.
There you go.
Okay. All right, I'm going to leave it here.
Yep.
Cindy Nolan, take it away.
Okay. All right. Thanks for joining us today. As Brian said, please put your name and your organization in the chat box so we have an understanding of who's joining us today. This is an intentionally small audience today because we limited our invitations, essentially, because this is a deeper dive into applying for Brownfields grants and how to be successful. It's not for every general audience. It's not a Brownfields 101. But first, I want to introduce the folks who are with us today. I'm Cindy Nolan. You heard from Brian Gross. He's one of our lead trainers on our staff. Nicole Rogers, do you want to wave your hand so that folks can see you? Yeah, there you go. And Brian Holtzclaw with our environmental justice team. Yep, he's waving his hand. Daphne Wilson with our environmental justice team. Daphne? Yeah, there you go. Okay. So if you guys want to go off camera while I'm finishing that, that's totally fine. So for today's focus, we are really going to look closely at how to be competitive for these Brownfields grants as a nonprofit. We do have a few slides about the program overall because we do have a few environmental justice communities who have some experience with EJ grants and might be willing and ready to take the next step joining us today. So we have a few general Brownfields slides, but this is not a Brownfields 101. We will work with our environmental justice team on a Brownfields 101, but that is not today, okay? So for the most part, the folks that we invited here were prior applicants to the Brownfields program who have not yet been successful. So these are the folks that we really want to reach out to. This training is not a substitute for the sub-criteria by sub-criteria training that our Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization will be making available to everybody. They do a 2-hour training after the guidelines are released, and they go sub-criteria by sub-criteria, and everybody in the world is invited to that. And we will make you aware of when that training is going to occur so that you can participate in that training. This, however, is going to jump a lot of those steps and just go drill much deeper into the areas where we've seen trouble spots. Slide 2, Brian. Okay, just a general orientation. What are brownfields? Just look bad in a community. They are defined by those who feel they have them. There's no particular definition of a brownfield site except the one that's provided here. It is real property. We're talking about real estate, and the expansion or redevelopment or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence, note the word potential, of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So in other words, the definition of a brownfield is extremely broad, one of the broadest we have in any of our statutes. And in short, it's anything that looks bad to an outsider. Could be a brownfield site. All right, next slide. All right, so here we just like to brag a little bit, show our befores and our afters. You know, Brownfields, we feel that this is a program that changes communities. And what we offer is what we call seed money. In other words, we're never going to fund enough for you to get from point A to point B, but we're going to get you on that pathway. We're going to get you started. And our funds are limited, but we can offer you the start. And after that, you jump into the private-public partnerships that get communities turned around. And this is where nonprofits come in. We recognize the critical role they play in gluing pieces together within a community. Nonprofits are incredible champions for the best interests of the communities and often for those who are voiceless. And those are the people and situations we want to reach most. They fill gaps that local governments and federal governments cannot fill. They have the ability to reach one person at a time and create change by reaching one person at a time. That's something we will never be able to do. And their role in this program is especially critical. And we're doing this presentation to work with you guys because we want you to know that we hear you and we see you. We're going to do our best to support you. Next slide. All right, just quickly, these are the types of grants that we have available in this program. The assessment grant for testing and sampling of properties, the cleanup grant. These two are our largest programs. Most money goes into these two. Only in the last 3 years have nonprofits been eligible for assessment grants. They've always been eligible for cleanup grants. The revolving loan grant fund, they're eligible for that. And the multipurpose and of course the job training. Now, revolving loan fund and multipurpose grants rotate years. These are our bigger pots of money, typically around $800,000, sometimes up to $1 million. And because they're worth so much more money, we rotate what year. So the coming year is a revolving loan fund grant availability. Last year was the multipurpose. Multipurpose is both a combination of assessment and cleanup grants. For some situations, we also have technical assistance opportunities. We can do a limited amount of site assessment with our funds. And we have some technical assistance opportunities to Brownfields, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right, next slide. All right, so just quickly, here's a profile of our applicants from last year. The number of applications and the number of nonprofit organizations. So first, let me tell you, Region 4 receives more applications than any other region. We are typically 25% of the national pool of proposals submitted in this region year after year after year. So we see a very small amount coming in from our nonprofits on assessments, again, because it's still a new program to them, but we see a lot of years of experience on the cleanup. So we think that that assessment pie is going to increase over time, and we want you to become successful. And this is what we're doing to try to help with that. All right, next slide. All right, nonprofit readiness. All right, we have a brochure that we had sent to you about readiness. We find that nonprofits in particular really have to assess their readiness for federal grant money. If they've had it in the past, they're probably ready. If they haven't had it, you really have to assess your capacity to manage a federal grant. Lots of strings on federal money, lots of strings. The point I'm going to emphasize here is that you have to have an organizational structure in place to manage federal funds. And in particular, it means that those who direct the project cannot also be the accountant. That's really the key two roles of distinction that they have to have. Those who pay out and have the accounting authority cannot have project direction authority. Also, readiness for Brownfields in particular, you need to connect your organization's mission with Brownfields redevelopment plans. There are different types of nonprofits out there. Some are land-based, some are function-based. Whatever mission you have to really work to connect it with the Brownfields mission. So we're going to try to help you do that today. And one of the keys of doing that is building that local partnership. Yeah. And we recommend forming a Brownfields team in that local partnership, which contains the local political support. So municipal planning divisions of local communities. in addition to engaging the local residents, you really have to show that you've got partnership with the local community. That's going to make a huge difference for nonprofits because you don't really have any authority in your jurisdictional area, but the local government does. So it's got to come to that partnership. You have to engage that local community, and it's really helpful if you can engage the landowner and you know whether or not you can access that site to conduct a phase 1 and phase 2. So those are kinds of conversations you need to really have in advance before you even submit the proposal. So we suggest that it takes a long time to actually get ready, establish all these pieces in place before you apply for this grant. And that's what we consider readiness. We want you to consider joining our state brownfield associations. We have 3 of them, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, and you can easily Google them. They will be a tremendous amount of support in getting you up to speed in this program. They work with communities all the time. They know the nuances of our grant programs, and they have great connections to developers and other resources that you may need in your partnerships. All right, next slide. General tips. Now these general tips, we actually go over these for a lot of folks because we're going to start general, then we're going to dig deep. But for nonprofits, it's particularly important to make sure that you're actually eligible. There are many IRS recognized nonprofit status organizations, but the only ones eligible to apply here are the 501c3. That's it. No 501c6. None of the other categories are eligible. Also, in terms of general tips, connect community needs to your project outcome and health benefits. In other words, you may be offering something, but you got to make sure that that fits a need that the community actually has right now. And that's an important connection that has to show up in the application. Another general tip is to understand that there are hard sections of our criteria and there are easy sections. 1 and 2 are the very hard sections. Most of our applicants lose points in sections 1 and 2, and the easy sections are 3 and 4. If you just kind of stick to what's being asked, you should be good on those sections. Mm-hmm. We're going to highlight a couple of potential weaknesses in those areas, but most of our focus is going to be on criteria 1 and 2. Number 4, use data to show the disproportionate impact. And here we're going to emphasize government data. We have an EJ screen, environmental justice screen. That's EPA database. It's updated every month. It pulls from all the federal databases. Use the US Census, use the State Department health data. The point is use federal and state data. As soon as you start wandering into private databases that highlight this or highlight that, one of the things that we find, and we've searched those databases, is that those data are old. They're typically pretty inflammatory. They're not the best sources for information to tell your story. So stick to government data. Number 5, do your homework. This is back to the readiness. Conversations around site selection, reuse planning, resource identification really have to begin early and include the local government authority, whether it's a city or it's a county, wherever you're working. Those folks have got to be involved up front. Next slide, Brian. Okay, here's another weakness that we find. People start telling different parts of the story in different areas. And I know the questions are conducive to that, but we also want to remind you to be internally consistent from section to section. Too often when we read these proposals, we have one need stated up front, and then all of a sudden there's all these different benefits at the very back. And we look at that, and I know you think you're offering us something in addition to what you asked for in your needs, but honestly, it starts to look like you're not really sure where you're going with this. So make sure your story is internally consistent. Your need is this, and at the end, you've met the need. All right, don't make up new things at the end that didn't show up at the beginning. That's a very common error. Number 7, think like a community, right? Our criteria were written for governments, and those criteria are not going to change anytime soon because we use statutory language. So until the statute changes, we don't see too many changes to the questions. And the availability of nonprofits to apply for assessment grants came as part of the Build Act 3 years ago, but never did it say that it was going to start changing the criteria in order to support nonprofit success. You have to think like a local community. And the best way to do that is to bring local community into this project. Number 8, there are 2 types of criteria in the guidelines. It starts with the ranking criteria and says, here's how these are the ranking criteria. And then several pages later, it's going to say, here's the evaluation criteria. And that's with all EPA grants, whether it's environmental justice grants, water division grants, or these Brownfields grants. And it's a grant-based requirement, has nothing to do with the program. And the whole idea is we're going to ask you what we want in the criteria, and then we're going to tell you how we're going to evaluate your proposal, right? So we are required to tell you that up front, how we're going to evaluate your proposal. And that's called the evaluation criteria. So anytime you write to the criteria, you do it to the evaluation criteria, not the ranking criteria. And of course, they say almost the same thing, but not quite. Because in the ranking criteria, what they're really going to focus on in many of the criteria is how this grant will help you achieve this in each of the criteria. So if you compare the 2 together, you're going to see the big differences in the evaluation criteria for each of the sub-criteria. It's going to say, and tell us how this grant's going to help. So pay particular attention to that.
Yeah, I think that's.
Number 9, drill deeper into the geographic area with knowledge from the locals. We often find that proposals fly at what we call the 10,000-foot level. And that might be fine for some organizations, but because this is such a competitive grant, we really want to see you drill deeper and show your knowledge of the local community in which you're working. And you get that knowledge from working closely with the locals on this. And number 10, show that in the proposal that you know where you're going, you know how to get there, and as soon as you get this money, you are ready to hit the ground running. You must convince us of your readiness. Okay, let's move on.
I don't think that's our problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Cindy.
Brian, your turn.
Yeah, I'm hearing a little bit of noise, I think. So if you could please put yourself on mute. And let me go back to our slides here. Okay, yeah, so Cindy just mentioned what we consider the hard sections and the easy sections, and that's just kind of where we usually see the scores at. So the first section that we're going to talk about is one of the hard sections. And again, kind of what we're trying to go for in this presentation is to clue you in a little bit for what the reviewers are looking for, which again is in the evaluation criteria. So section 1, this is going to be basically where you're describing where you're doing your work. So if you think of the entire proposal as far as who, what, when, where, why, what we're looking for in section 1 is what you're going to be doing and what you're working towards, and the where you intend to do that work. And remember, as Cindy said, think in terms of the community level. We know organizations, and this includes local governments, they introduce brownfields properties that they may have a particular interest in, but what the criteria are asking for is how is that significant to the community? Is there a significance to them, or is it only in relation to the organization that's writing the application? So, some examples might be, is the site, does it have historical significance? Is it on a prominent corner where it's, a public eyesore, or kind of an ugly standout? Or it could be something where it's an obstruction to the redevelopment plan. So let's say it's in the way of the construction of a new bike path, or the expansion of a park, or something like that. So that's kind of what we see in 1A, is kind of a disconnect between the focus for the organization and the applicant, and then the broader community, which, remember, is the way the criteria are written. That is kind of what we're going to be looking for. 1B, the revitalization plans. This is kind of where you're going. So I guess kind of a hypothetical where off in the future, not the geographical location. And this is really something that is probably more of a challenge for a nonprofit versus a government body, because what the criteria is asking for is to fit the reuse plan that you have and that you're working towards in with some of the formal planning documents that are in place for your county or your region or your town. And most of the time, those are written by the local governments, so they, they're more familiar with them because they're the framework that they are working in within themselves. So as nonprofit organizations that are not necessarily directly involved with that, you need to, you're a step removed, so you need to tap into them from, I guess, a little bit from the outside, but also be familiar with them. And then, of course, if you're applying for assessment funding, which is going to be the sampling and testing at the brownfield sites that you're discussing, you need to think of how that is going to open up the door to get you towards that redevelopment. So again, if you think of the assessment funding as just kind of seed money to get you there, how is that going to help you unlock additional funding sources for cleanup if that is determined to be necessary, and the redevelopment, which ultimately gets you to the revitalization. So sometimes we call that a project roadmap if you kind of plan it out step by step, but that's kind of what you need to be thinking of in terms of this first section. So basically defining the project area, discussing the priority site or sites, and the significance to your community, and then explaining how the grant that you're applying for is going to help get you to the vision that you have for this site. Cindy, back to you.
All right, section 2. I'm just going to say more points are lost in criteria 2 than any other criteria, even more so than in criteria 1. And I personally feel that it's because of the way the criteria are articulated. It makes it kind of difficult to understand what EPA is actually looking for. The criteria follow the statutory language. And the lawyers who wrote it, well-intended as they were, kind of put everything in the mix with each question, which makes it a little difficult to figure out exactly what EPA is after. I just did a debrief last week, and one of the guys said, I couldn't figure out what you guys really wanted for this. And we hear that a lot. So we're gonna try and clarify that. I also want to point out that the tip sheet goes into sub-criteria by sub-criteria, whereas we don't do that here. So please take a look at that tip sheet and drill even a little bit deeper than we're going to get here. The second most common reason that people lose points in this criteria is because this criteria has more commas than all the other criteria. And you go, commas? And really what I'm saying is the criteria, the sub-criteria have a lot of elements within. And you have to pay attention to each and every element, because I always say there's two kinds of reviewers. They're the big picture reviewers who will look at the overall situation and go, wow, this is a really community of high need. This seems to match perfectly, and they're fairly happy with that. But there's the detailed reviewers who are going to look at everything and they're going to go, okay, did you include this? And they'll look at the document and look at the next comment and they'll say, oh, did you include this? And if there's something an element that wasn't addressed for all priority sites, every one of them, they'll point that out and you'll lose a point. These grants are so competitive. In last year, if you lost more than 3 points, you didn't get the grant, right? So I'm advising you to be sensitive to the two kinds of reviewers we have and make sure that you meet both of their needs, because neither type of reviewer is wrong, right? And I just want to remind you that all proposals are reviewed by 3 different people for the assessment grants and 2 people for the cleanup grants. So you're getting a lot of input and reviews and a lot of perspectives on every proposal. The third reason that folks don't tend to not do well in this one is because they don't present the data well. This is a data criteria. and it looks for health data and it looks for demographic data. And if you are not presenting the data in a comparative way, or if you're using an unusual source, or there are any other problems, the reviewers will hit you on the data. So that's a third area that we see comments. The fourth area is basically community engagement. EJ Brownfields program, we are much more particular about how the community get engaged and how their comments are incorporated for these programs, perhaps than any other EPA program. These are supposed to be community-based solutions, community-based programs. So we're very sensitive to how the community gets engaged and how you describe that. So 4 reasons to not do well in this criteria. These are the 4 reasons that most reviewers will hit on. So know that up front. So let's see what we can do to address some of these weaknesses. So in the community need, you know, sometimes we look at it and we go, well, why can't the community do this themselves? We have to ask that question. So really what you want to do is demonstrate not that so much that the community that you're serving in that general geographic area is poor, you can add that, but that the local community can't do this on their own either. And neither can you. You don't have the funds to do this. So you've got to obtain the financial perspective and the financial challenges of the local community. Otherwise, if they could meet it on their own, then why are we seeking federal funds, right? So you really have to cover those 3 areas on that financial need. The community is poor, the local government can't fund it because they don't have the money, and you as a nonprofit don't have the funds to do this either, okay? That's an important base to cover. The health and welfare of sensitive populations. Now, remember, when we put these weaknesses, we're actually using comments from last year's reviewer comments on the nonprofit proposals. So this is actual language that we are showing you here. What are the health conditions and threats to the residents, like cancer, asthma, etc., that can plausibly be linked to the site? And the solution is, again, we're looking for real data, distinguish your demographic data, discuss the populations that are sensitive, and using general knowledge of the site type, you have to link some of those conditions, health conditions of the community, plausibly back to the site. So, because we're in the business of protecting human health, we want to know that if we're assessing or cleaning up a site, that it is going to reduce a potential source of exposure to the local community. So you've got to draw those links. Next slide. Community engagement. All right, this is another area of great weakness. A wide array, here's a real comment from the reviewer. A wide array of interests are represented, but too narrow in the target area. Response is not including local organizations or local community members. This is a real problem for those nonprofits that are not geographically based. So if you're mission based, this is where you've really got to work to show that you plan to engage the local residents. You plan and already have on your partnership team the local government authority so that they are with you through this process. They are supportive of you. It's not enough to simply say what you're doing is consistent with their redevelopment plans. No bueno, that will not fly. You need to have local government as part of your partnership. And that becomes really crucial to the story that you need to tell, because we're also going to look for you to have more invested in the community outreach budget. Because you don't represent the local government, you're going to have to work a little bit harder to get the time and attention of those who live in the community. And you're going to have to demonstrate that you will be responsive to their input. So if they look at a particular site and they go, yeah, I like what you do, but I don't like it in this location, you need to have an answer to that. I looked at a proposal, it was a draft proposal from one of the consultants for a community in Mississippi. And they were planning on a men's homeless shelter. And it was a great idea. It was a great proposal. And after the proposals were submitted, I circled back with them and I said, wow, I saw this great proposal. What happened to it? And he said, well, we followed your suggestion and we involved the local community. We went to the mayor's office and the planning department. And they said, yeah, we love what you do, but not in this location. No, we have other plans for this location. So we are sensitive to this because nothing will stop a project faster than when we start to hear from the community that they're not being heard. EPA will intervene and we will figure out what's going on. So make it clear in the proposal that you are listening, that you're engaging the local community, and then you should have no trouble with the application. Next slide. All right, back to you with criteria.
Yeah, that brings it back
Brian.
to me. Yeah, and I'd like to just add something to what Cindy was just talking about, which is in all those sections where it's asking for community need, because of the space considerations, my suggestion, if that is an issue for you, is to think about the end use of your project or the redevelopment and kind of work backwards from there. Think about what need that is that redevelopment is going to be responsive to and what that is fulfilling, and then think about how you can show evidence of that need throughout that section, whether that's public health or transportation or housing or whatever that is. So kind of work backwards from there. As I was working on this, again, I was thinking about the who, what, when, where, why. So why are you working towards that particular redevelopment, and how can you show that? So moving on to section 3 or criteria 3, this is, I call this kind of the nuts and bolts section. We're into what should be a little bit of an easier question, where you're basically just going to be explaining what you plan to do with the grant funding, who is going to be working on it for you, presenting the budget and the schedule, that kind of thing. So kind of the how and the when. A few things to know. The project period is generally expected to be 3 years. There, I believe, is a question in there about the project schedule. So just kind of keep that in mind, that that's kind of what you'll want to be fitting your schedule into. There is also, unless it's going to change next year, but there is kind of a real simple, clear format in the criteria that kind of explains what we're looking for, which is kind of a little bit about the task description. So a narrative about what you're going to be doing. And to be honest, if you're applying for assessment funding, that's almost going to be the same for every one of these applications. You know, X number of sites that need phase 1 and phase 2 assessment, probably a little bit of overhead, some outreach costs, and we usually see some cleanup or redevelopment planning. So once you've done your testing and sampling and kind of have the results, then where do you go from there based on those results? Is it a site that's ready for redevelopment, or is it going to need a little bit of cleanup care to get there? So those tasks are going to be pretty consistent from proposal to proposal. It also asks about who is going to be responsible for leading those tasks, and as I mentioned, the schedule, and then the outputs, which is basically just quantifying what you're going to accomplish. So let's say you're going to do 10 phase 1s and 5 phase 2s is an example of an output. Really, through this section, my advice is don't get too wild. Just as Cindy said, read the criteria and basically respond back to that, and you should be okay through here. Just be careful, watch your numbers, watch your outputs, make sure they're consistent all the way through. If you have any questions about additional activity and whether it is eligible or not, you can follow up with us. That sometimes causes confusion on the reviewer's part. So again, I kind of recommending sticking to what's, I guess I'll call it a typical project, which are the items I just mentioned. Here's some examples of cost calculations. This is a very common weakness, which causes less than full points to be earned, which is a budget that just includes basically line items, but does not show how they were derived or calculated. So the more detail you can show behind that, and the better you can do that for each and every item in the budget, that's really what the reviewers are going to be looking for, how those costs were developed and where they came from. So these are good examples of personnel costs and travel costs. If you have that, usually what we're going to see is personnel, travel, supplies, and the actual assessment work, which is almost always contractual. I don't think I've ever seen it done in-house. So you'll want to explain where those costs came from, how they were calculated, and very important, show your math and be consistent. So you're going to show the calculations, and you're also going to show a budget table, which is this slide. Again, just it helps to have an editor. Just be sure you're being consistent on the numbers, the calculations, and again, the number of outputs. So as I mentioned, this is kind of what we're going to see in a typical proposal. Make sure you have 50% or more of the budget in direct environmental assessment work, that being your phase 1 sampling and your phase 1 assessments and your phase 2 sampling. In this example, those were 2 separate tasks. So each column is a task. You can see here, task 1, program management, task 2, community outreach. So they split it up here into 2 tasks. You may have a single task for all your assessment work, but make sure it's greater than 50% of the budget. Again, that's probably going to be a contractual line item. This example does not have supplies, but we do usually see supplies for outreach as a small number, a couple of thousand usually. Travel is encouraged. Cindy mentioned, particularly for states that have brownfields associations, they may have a conference that you're interested in attending. The national conference that EPA co-hosts is held every other year. So in a 3-year project period, you would expect at least one of those. And I would say about half the proposals have personnel. Some do, some don't. It's certainly not a problem to include it. But again, just show how the costs were calculated. What we don't see is equipment, and the other category there is also pretty rare. So again, I suggest kind of being a little, I guess, conservative with the approach and the framework that you're showing in task 3, which again is just the budget and the kind of the preliminary work plan. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention, there would be no reason for you to know this, but we use a database called Acres to track our site work. The main reporting requirement that sometimes reviewers will look for is that reports are done quarterly and submitted to the project officer. So it doesn't hurt to throw in a little more detail on how frequently you're reporting and how you are tracking the actual site work that's being done. Again, that's quarterly reports in the Acres database, and that is in the tip sheet, I believe. And section 4, Cindy, back to you.
Section 4. Okay.
Okay.
Brian, are you covering section 4?
I can. Yeah, this is a short and easy one. This is the last.
Let's have you cover it.
Yeah, this is the last section of the proposal. Last year, the page limit was 10, and this is usually the last page, or sometimes even less than a page. This, again, who, what, when, where, why, for me, this is the who. So you're describing your organization. You're actually naming individuals that are going to be working on the grant if it's to be awarded, and basically describing the grant management experience. Remember, Cindy talked about readiness. So if your organization has not had grant experience, you're going to fall into the third category here across the bottom. And really that is, it's called a neutral score, but I think it's half of the available scoring for this section. So that is going to be less than full points. So that's going to be a little bit of a disadvantage for you. But you can talk about grants that you've received from other organizations. We see lots of grants from sometimes at the state level, and a lot from local foundations and that sort of thing. So it's really any kind of outside funds that you've received and managed that you can talk about here. So the tips for this section are: make sure you're naming staff that are going to be working on the project, and the best thing is if they themselves have grant management experience, because you're using names here. When you're describing past grants, whether they're from EPA, I think most of the nonprofits are not in that category. You're probably going to be in the middle category here. But what we're looking for here is, again, the outputs. So what was accomplished with those grants? I believe you're asked to identify the funding source and the amount. If that's not specifically in there, that is a good thing to include. So I see this done a lot of times in tables, which is a very clear and concise way to do it. You can just summarize when it was awarded, who the funder was, the amount of funding that was received, and just a bullet or a sentence about what was accomplished. So construction of a green space, that kind of thing. Very brief, very clear what was accomplished. And then the second part of that is an affirmation that you follow the terms and conditions. So most likely that was reporting requirements. Depending on the nature of the grant, maybe there were some technical aspects for it, and then usually some kind of wrap up. So, but just a very clear sentence or two about what was accomplished, what the outputs were, and that you followed the terms and conditions, and did everything you were asked to do conditionally with that funding.
Brian, let me add that this is another criteria with commas. So make sure every element is actually addressed.
Yes,
or points will be lost.
Yeah, and this section can be a little confusing if you're following in the criteria, because you're basically choosing A, B, or C. So don't let that trip you up. You're only going to fall into one of these three categories. Again, most likely the one that's in the middle at the bottom of the slide here. Yeah, let's talk about what's coming next. First of all, let me reiterate, I think we said this, but we're talking mostly off reviewer comments from last year's criteria, last year's ranking and evaluation criteria. So we're not expecting any major revisions, but definitely pay attention to the national training webinar that Cindy mentioned. We've been told by EPA headquarters that the deadline this year is going to be a deadline sometime in November. So backing that up, we're expecting a publication most likely next month, sometime in September. So keep an eye out for that. It will be followed by that national training webinar, which will go over the forthcoming guidelines and criteria, and certainly any changes. So definitely be aware of that. That'll be covered, and I think they usually publish that on the EPA website, which you can see here. The last bullet here is our regional website. We post some of the documents, and we will post the tip sheet there. The tip sheet should have been attached to the meeting invite. If you're here, you should be able to download it from there, as well as a copy of the slides, and also the readiness brochure that Cindy mentioned up front. And here's the contact info for Cindy and myself. If you have any questions about eligibility or anything related to your project that you are thinking about or have questions.
Brian, I want to emphasize that we can answer eligibility questions at any time. If you have questions on some of the other criteria, however, and the guidelines are out, we have to be radio silent. For 10 months of the year, we're available to help you with anything that you need a better understanding of. Once the guidelines are released, we're not really allowed to talk to individuals about how best to answer questions in the criteria. That's
right. Eligibility is usually more of an issue for cleanup proposals, because there's a long checklist of items that you have to fulfill if you actually own the site. For assessment, we mentioned it, but the big thing is if you're a nonprofit, you need to be a 501c3 only for assessment funding. So if there's any question about that, we can talk about that, but that's the big one for assessment funding. And I think we are going to turn it over to Brian Holtzclaw and Daphne now.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks you so much for being a part of this today. Having come from the Brownfields program and helping run the EJ and Children's Health program, I can say, you know, it's very good that you afford yourself for this opportunity. As Cindy and Brian and gang have said, these are extremely competitive grants, and we really want to give you as nonprofits a leg up in this competition. So my program, the EJ program, I'm going to hand the baton off to Daphne. It's a great program to dovetail with your community's needs. Whether or not you have a Brownfields grant, we invited some of our grantees, or really strong nonprofits that we've worked with, that we think are real great candidates to learn from Cindy's presentation. But for the others who don't have a clue perhaps about EJ grants, I'm going to tip my hat to Daphne and go ahead and take it away.
All righty. Brian, let's start with the next slide. Okay, so the Environmental Justice Small Grant Program, we have 3 types of grants in our EJ grant program. The Environmental Justice Small Grants Program, which many of you have applied for and successfully received. The Collaborative Problem Solving Grant, and the State Environmental Justice Cooperative Agreement. So the Environmental Justice Grant, the goal of that grant is to help affected communities create solutions to environmental justice or injustice needs that they have in their communities. The grants traditionally have been up to $30,000, but this current year, it is $75,000. That just shows how the new administration is really focusing on the needs of disadvantaged communities. And before, we've offered maybe 5 grants per region, and this year is going to be 10 to 12 grants per region. So I would, I'm not going to talk much more about this because you guys are familiar with it already, but these are the details for the Environmental Justice Small Grants. And we're currently evaluating the applications that were submitted this year. So look forward to the announcement that will come out next year. The Environmental Justice Small Grant is an annual grant program. So next slide. Okay, then we have the EJ Collaborative Problem Solving Grant, and the focus of the Collaborative Problem Solving Grant is also to address environmental and public health issues, but it is through partnerships with other stakeholders. These grants are $120,000. They have been in the past, and this year, I think this year, the Collaborative Problem Solving Grant will be.
Daphne, you're on mute.
I just realized that. I'm so sorry. Okay, so did you guys hear anything that I said?
Yeah, we just lost you about 20 seconds ago. Maybe you can start from the beginning of this slide.
About the collaborative problem solving?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the collaborative problem solving grants, usually they have been maybe 2 grants per region. This year, there's like, I want to say 5 grants per region. And they have traditionally been $120,000, and this year they're $200,000. But the purpose of the Collaborative Problem Solving Grant is similar to the environmental justice small grant, where you address public health and environmental and public health issues in your community. The key to this one is that you work collaboratively with other stakeholders, be it government, academia, etc., to come to a solution to address whatever those issues are. So those guys would be your partners in the project that you're trying to implement. Next slide. Okay, so the State Environmental Justice Cooperative Agreement Program, this is for states and municipalities and towns, and those grants are $200,000 each. This year, we're gonna have 5 for the region. And normally there's only been 1 to 2 per region. And I think we had one this past year. We will have an additional, well, we had a competition, I guess, last year. And then we selected some from the competition that that were not successful. So we selected 3 additional ones from last year in order to increase, so we wouldn't have like 3 competitions in 1 year, which is, I've never seen that happen before. So this one, if you have an idea for a collaborative, for such a grant, I would suggest, being a nonprofit, that you go to your state or municipality and, give them your idea and let them apply, because you can work as a partner with them, but you could not apply for this particular grant. But the collaborative problem solving grant and the EJ small grant, you can apply for those. Now, the collaborative problem solving grant, it comes out every other year. So it's a 2-year grant, and the environmental justice grants are 1-year grants. Okay, next slide, Ryan. Okay. And if you have other questions or need more information about these environmental justice grant programs, you can contact me. I'm the grants coordinator, and I provide oversight for Florida and South Carolina. Next slide.
Yeah, I think that's the
I guess that's
final
it.
slide. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to kind of, in reference to tips, I just wanted to piggyback on some of the things that you guys said before. With all of our grants, it is very crucial that you follow the criteria and that you are very specific, because if you explain one component of the question and not the other, for example, if the question says to explain what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and you explain what you're going to do and you don't get into the details of how, then, your points will be taken away. And a lot of times people don't realize that they're not being as specific as needed. And also, another point that I'd like to emphasize too is, when you're describing your community, make sure that you identify and that you include factors that justify that you or your community is disproportionately impacted. So if you have any questions about those things, using our EJ screening tool is a good way to to, you know, I guess, come up with the information that you would need to support the demographics and the burden on your community. So I would suggest, if you have not used or tried and played around with our EJ screen tool, I would suggest that as well. Brian, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, if you have an interest in teaching any of our EJ Screen 101 trainings, just indicate that in the chat box and we'll be sure to include you. We've got some coming up. These are especially instrumental, not just for our grants, but Brownfields. And when you do your geographic area in EJ Screen and press standard report, that third page really can help tremendously as far as seeing how the 11 environmental indicators that you have within your target area compares with the rest of the state. And if it's markedly above the 50th percentile, you need to really bring home that point that you've got multiple impacts and probably cumulative impacts as well. Enough said. Thank you for being on today, and we look forward to working with you.
We're going to take some questions now. If you want to put your questions in the chat box, we'll address those first. And then otherwise you can go off mic and we'll address those questions there. But let me take some of the questions that are on the chat. There was a question about the RLF applications. This is an RLF year. So if you plan to apply for the RLF revolving loan fund, recognize that it's a type of cleanup grant where we give you a grant to sub-grant to others. It's more geographically based than the other grants because we have to know exactly what geographic area this RLF applies to. This year, we are highly recommending coalition applications for RLFs. There's a long history behind this. RLFs are great grants, but we find that after a couple of years of having these potentially 15-year grants, there's a fatigue level. And they end up sitting on money, and then they're just not into the sub-granting anymore. We end up taking that back. Out of the state of Florida in the last couple of years, we've taken back a couple of $1 million. And that's money lost to the state, it's lost to our region, and it gets redistributed across the United States. So we'd like to see coalitions representing broad geographic areas. And we do have a tip sheet on that at our Region 4 website, which is listed on, what slide number, Brian? It's on the contact page where Brian and I are listed, slide 17. And then there was a question about what do I mean by difference between the administrative and the technical lead? There are two areas where this becomes important in your application. One is the key contacts form, which you must submit with your application. And it's also important in the programmatic capability description. So in the key contacts form, you're asked to provide names of 4 individuals: the authorized representative, the payee, the administrative contact, and the principal investigator. And some people submit this form and it's the same name all the way through, and you can't have that. So where the administrative contact is concerned, that needs to be a different name. So it's just like whoever does the work is really attached to the work that they've authorized. You need an arm's length distance between the accounting people who actually pay out that work and those who have authorized that work. That's a checks and balance type of approach, and that's what we're looking for. So in your programmatic capability, when you're describing the key people involved in the project, we do want to see that there is an accountant and it's not the same as the principal investigator. So I hope that answers that question. Let's see.
Cindy?
Yes, jump in.
Yeah, this is Daphne. I just want to say for the EJ small grants, I guess because the amounts are a lot smaller than the Brownfields grants, we don't necessarily have a problem with that being the same person. So
I have a little skepticism on that, Daphne.
Mm-hmm.
You may be right, but this is a grants condition. It's not particular to the grant program.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
I would check with our grants office because I don't think that's the case.
Okay.
I'm willing to be
Yeah.
wrong.
I just know that some of the smaller nonprofits, they're, a one-man show or a two-man show or something.
We have that same issue with some of our communities where the mayor is actually a volunteer job and the only person that's paid is the city clerk, right? And we still have to have that difference. The city clerk
Okay.
pays, the mayor oversees.
Okay. Well, I may stand corrected then.
I'm just suggesting you check with the grants office. Another question came in, if you've already got the city support for the property identified, can you use the funds to rehab the building? No, not under our assessment grants and not under our cleanup grants. So the assessment grant stops at taking the samples and analyzing the samples. You can do a certain amount, of planning, advanced planning for reuse of the property, but you cannot actually use the funds to begin the rehab of the building. The same with cleanup. So if we take dirty soil out and our grant ends when we put clean soil back in, that's where the grant ends. So there's no site prep allowed in any of our costs. There's nothing that will take you to the next step. We consider those next steps as leverage costs. So we're happy to learn about them, but we don't fund them. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's a good example. In section 1, we talked about how is this assessment grant, if you think of it as seed funding, how is that going to help you get to the resources that can help you with the rehab? So maybe they're dependent on a site acquisition, so you need a phase 1, or maybe it's a residential use, so you need to verify that there's not contamination above a certain level. So that's a very good distinction there.
Yeah. Okay. So any other questions that are not in the chat?
There was a question from Chanel that I believe it was Chanel at 1147. What did you mean that the accounting authority cannot be the project lead?
I answered that.
Oh, you did? Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see that. I believe that was all the questions. If anyone wants to unmute themselves, we can do that now.
I think there's another question from Canaria that came at 12 p.m. in the chat. It says, what if you already have city support for the property identified? Can you use the funds?
Yeah, we answered that.
Oh, you answered that one too.
Yeah, the answer is no. Yeah. There are limits to the applicability of our funds to the work. Yeah. And we actually have a frequently asked questions section when we release the guidelines. And from last year, you can go on the website and access the frequently asked questions. And I know that question's addressed at some level of detail. All right. Anything else from anyone?
Cindy, they can also find previous projects that were funded on your website, right?
No, you have to ask us for those.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for examples of proposals that are successful, what we do is we give out other regions' examples. We don't use our own. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but we will give examples of successful proposals from other regions. So if you ask us, we'll be happy to give you some.
You can also get those through FOIA, which is kind of cumbersome, or you can, it's called the grant fact sheet tool that posts the names of successful grants every year. So if you have any trouble finding some, you may be able to at least identify the groups that way. And if you need help getting to that, feel free to reach out to me, Brian Gross, anytime.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
As far as
with EJ, that, I'm sorry, Daphne.
Just quickly. As far as the EJ grants, if you go to OEJ's website, you can find the previous successful applicants, and it won't give you the details, but it will give you what this project was and what was funded.
Okay. Okay. With that, thank you, Daphne. With that, we're going to wrap it up. And if we can answer any questions on anything, ask us in the next couple of weeks before the guidelines come out. And we'll be happy to help you with whatever you need. And yeah, best of luck. And we hope that you're successful. But if you're not, always ask for a debrief. And we will give you a deeper dive on your proposal in particular.
Thank you for the invitation to this call. We really appreciate the time that you took to explain this to us. We're grateful for it.
Yeah, definitely take a look at the tip sheet too, because that goes sub-criteria by sub-criteria. We did not do that here. So we're doing what we can to help this important segment of community redevelopment. All right, so thank you all for attending. With that, Brian, let's cut off the recording and we'll end the call. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.